Hello there, welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Shaz Lichadello.
This week, the latest 2024 campaign news and more from our interview with Putin critic Bill Browder about the death of his friend ALEXEI Navalny.
And we'll be continuing the foreign policy focus with a look at the forgotten dictatorship in North Korea. It's doubling down on its nuclear weapons and walking away from diplomacy.
But first, Chaz, let's start with news from the American presidential election campaign. In the Republican primary contest, voters go to the polls in Nikki Haley's home state of South Carolina this weekend, and there are signs that Haley has been making inroads into Trump's lead. Insider Advantage had a poll putting her 22 points behind the former president. That's a lot of ground to make up in a week, but it is the best poll yet for the state's former governor. Haley has been running increasingly critical ads in the state as well, like this one.
He just can't help himself. The ranting and raving, chaos follows him, and he's getting older.
We will restore on this planet peace through earth.
Running to settle old scores. It's about him, not you.
Well, we're going to find out this weekend whether that is resonating with voters or not, and if not, whether Nikki Haley is going to stay in this race through until Super Tuesday on March the 5th, when 16 states will vote. So far, Haley says, well, she's going nowhere. She's in this for the long haul.
I'm fighting for what I know is right, and I don't care what the party leaders and political elites want. I'll keep fighting until the American people close the door. That day is not today. And it won't be on Saturday, not by a long shot. The presidential primaries have barely begun.
Meanwhile, former President Trump has been scaring the bejesus out of South Carolinian voters. Watch here how he pivots from Laura Ingram's softball question about his safety to a quite apocalyptic warning.
I mean, if you don't mind me asking, because I know this is a very faith-filled audience here, and I know there are people across the globe pray for you and your safety. They're worried about your safety.
No, they are.
And they want. Do you feel that? Do you feel the power of that?
I do, but can I be honest? I worry about their safety too. These people, everybody in this room is in great danger right now. We have a nuclear weapon that if you hit New York, South Carolina is going to be gone too. I worry about their safety. I think it's the reason I'm doing this.
I worry about a guy running for president who thinks that a nuclear weapon that hits New York is going to bother people in South Carolina. I mean, it wouldn't be good.
No,
not nice to be downwind, but it's not going to wipe out South Carolina. So it's maybe weird comments like that, which is why Nikki Haley is still digging in for the long haul in this campaign. There are both Republican and Democratic primaries in the swing state of Michigan next Tuesday as well. Trump leading Haley there by 60 points. That's according to the most recent public poll, which isn't actually all that recent. It's 3 weeks old now. Nobody is really bothering with public polls for the Democrats in Michigan. Biden was 70 points in front of his only serious rival, Dean Phillips, in a Target poll. That came through in mid-January. What makes this contest more interesting, though, is that Trump is leading Biden in Michigan by 4 points. That according to a poll this week from Epic MRA. Michigan emerging as a must-win state for Joe Biden in November. Part of that old Democrat blue wall he wants to keep intact.
Yeah, now this might give you all the impression that nothing's really changed much in the Republican primary for the last month, but there's actually been some movement. Nikki Haley is now much less popular. These are Nikki Haley's favourables amongst Republicans. That's the pink line going down. You can see her unfavourables, the orange line going up. They're going to cross each other soon. That is not a recipe for winning a primary. You never cross the streams, John. And that is partly because she's been enduring withering attacks from Trump supporters. Trump's ex-doctor, now congressional supporter, Ronnie Jackson, asked, for instance, is there really any difference between these two party traitors anymore? Referring to Liz Cheney and Nikki Haley there. I don't think so. It's even beginning to affect Haley's general election polling. You might recall she used to do much better than Trump did against Biden. But if we take NPR's last poll, you can see Nikki Haley and Trump are performing the same against Biden, both up by 1 point. But if you lift the lid on that, Haley's only winning 78% of the Republican vote against Joe Biden, whereas Trump is winning 93% of the Republican vote. To be clear, Republicans are not voting for Joe Biden against Nikki Haley. They're just refusing to support Nikki Haley. They'd stay home, even against Biden. Whereas Haley does much better amongst Democrats than Trump does. In other words, even if Trump had to drop out it's not at all clear that Republicans would accept Haley as their nominee. So, John, I ask you, what is the point?
Yeah, it's been the subject of a lot of analysis and op-eds and punditry over the last couple of weeks. What is Nikki Haley's game? Because these polls are quite definitive. Unless there is something monumental happens, Nikki Haley is going to keep losing these states, and she's not going to be picking up any delegates because we're moving into a winner-takes-all phase of the Republican primary. So what is she doing? The most likely answer to that is she is simply positioning herself to be the leader of the Republican Party once Trump is gone. Now, that could be in August this year when Trump criminally convicted, suddenly Republicans turn on him and decide to parachute somebody else into their nomination. Highly, highly unlikely. Much more likely, whether Trump is re-elected or not, he is not allowed to run for another term in 2028. So Haley, I think, is probably just counting on the fact that there will be a lot of buyer's remorse in that post-Trump period, and that Trumpism will end with Trump's second term or his defeat this year. And Nikki Haley is thinking, well, I want to be the first cab off the rank in 2028. And traditionally, Republicans have tended to nominate the runner-up from last time as their standard bearer in the next election. Trump disrupted that pattern, but that has historically been what Conservatives have done in the United States. So to me, that is the most likely scenario. Interesting to see how she is becoming more and more critical of Donald Trump, ruling out the possibility of being his vice presidential running mate. But otherwise, it's hard to see what she is doing unless she really just wants to be a spoiler now.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think those Republican polling numbers I cited before suggest that she's not going to be the heir apparent. She's actually becoming less popular amongst Republicans as time goes on. She might not realise that, but she is.
I think she's counting on the fever breaking and for people to go, Trump was a disaster either as a failed nominee this year or as a second-term president for the next 4 years.
I suspect there'll be a lot of Trump supporters who hold grudges, though. Look, I don't know. We're just reading minds here. My suspicion is that maybe she's just annoyed. She's got money. She might as well, it's not like she doesn't need to drop out. She's got heaps of money to keep on going. And Trump's just really giving her the heebie-jeebies at this point in time, I suspect. And so she's a human being who's just reacting out, which is why she's becoming more critical as well. That's my guess. I don't know. Either way, it's not going anywhere during this primary. I know that. But that doesn't mean that the primaries don't hold some interest. Just not this primary. It's over in the Democratic primary that the interest lies between Biden and nobody. The Listen to Michigan campaign is seeking to get Democrats to vote uncommitted in the Michigan primary next week. What's that all about? They're demanding that Biden support a ceasefire in Gaza. And pushing this campaign is Palestinian-American House Rep Rashida Tlaib.
Right now, we feel completely neglected and just unseen by our government. If you want us to be louder, then come here and vote uncommitted.
So let's see what happens. They're hoping to win the support of more than 10% of the Democratic electorate next week, so we'll see if they do. By the way, that would be more than enough of a protest vote to lose Michigan for Joe Biden, so that's a legitimate warning for him. So anyway, this time next week, we'll know exactly how much trouble Joe Biden really is in with his base.
There was a similar effort to this, of course, in New Hampshire, where Joe Biden himself was a write-in candidate. There was a campaign to get ceasefire as a write-in option.
And it failed.
And only got a couple of percent of the support. Obviously, Michigan, with a much larger Muslim and Palestinian-American population, it could make the difference. But we're talking about, Muslims make up about 1% of the overall American population. Palestinian-American community is very small. We're talking 200,000 in the entire United States. Goodly number in Michigan. But this is a proxy battle for the left. This is the Bernie Sanders wing of the party as much as it is the Palestinian or Muslim wing of the party. So this is could be Biden's people will be saying, look, don't worry, this is just the grumbling you get from the squad and the Bernie Sanders sort of diehards. When the choice is between not Joe Biden and ceasefire or uncommitted, but the choice between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, they're going to vote for Joe Biden. That's their theory of the case. Also, in 9 months from now, there will have probably been a ceasefire. Israel will still not be conducting the kind of operations it is in Gaza. So this problem goes away by then, they hope.
The only thing I would say about this is that I think they're taking it seriously because Joe Biden in the last 2-3 weeks has signed executive order after memo sucking up to Palestinian Americans. Just last week, there was a supposed memo where he was restricting the use of weapons that are given as aid to other countries if they're used for purposes that breach international law, which is obviously a signal to Israel. There was another memo this week saying Palestinians who are illegal immigrants get to stay in America until the war is over because it's too dangerous. He's had a few of them. He's had one after another. Now, most of these aren't actually doing much. Most of them are symbolic. But the fact he keeps signing them suggests to me that he knows he might have a problem. I mean, look, we'll see next week how much of a problem he's got. I mean, you're right. 9 months is plenty of time for them to cool down, but we'll see. They're not the only ones freaking out, though. There's been a full freak out from Democrats across the board this week, and these kinds of results aren't cheering them up. According to Gallup, Biden's approval is 41%, which is fully 4% lower than any other president at this point of the cycle in polling history. Although, admittedly, that second worst polling president, Obama, won re-election handily. The other interesting part of Gallup's polling, when they asked if people felt better off than they did 3 years ago, a pretty key question in any election, Biden actually was right in the middle of the pack as far as recent presidents go. The recent president who had the best result on this question was Trump, who did not win re-election. Admittedly, 3 years ago, America was in the middle of the pandemic, so you'd hope they'd be better off now. But anyway, one more thing. Following up from last week, we discussed responses to the economy. We talked about how one of the problems Biden might be facing is grocery price inflation might be more than general inflation. Well, we've got it confirmed now. Turns out I was absolutely right. Food inflation has been massive over the last few years compared to general inflation. And even though it's now levelling off, it will take a while for people to get used to that. People in 2022 were paying the highest slice of their income on food in 30 years. Is it all too late, John? According to Ezra Klein in the New York Times, it's time to start readying the Democrat convention for the next load of candidates. What do you think?
Well, look, anything is possible, but clearly President Biden believes that with the economy on the upswing and the potency of anti-Trump sentiment in the wider community, concerns about Joe Biden's age will seem less important come November than they do right now. That's the theory of the case. Interesting, though, to see a few potential replacements to Joe Biden taking centre stage this week. I noticed as well the important decision that was made after a Supreme Court ruling in the state of Alabama, which effectively said that embryos produced in the course of an IVF program have the rights of a human, which has led IVF providers in the state of Alabama to cease operations temporarily while they try and take in all of this. This was basically people who'd had multiple embryos created and frozen, and then the embryos were destroyed because of freezers breaking down or what have you, that it gave them legal recourse. But now we've seen the extension of this abortion debate into IVF, and whereas abortion is pretty popular in the United States, about 65% of Americans support abortion in many or most cases, about 85% support IVF. So this really puts an extra lot of fuel under the fire that says that Roe versus Wade being overturned by Trump's Supreme Court, this is now going into extreme areas where you're now saying not just people that want to not have kids are affected, but people who do want to have kids are being affected. This is an unintended consequence that some have been warning in a sort of a slippery slope argument for a couple of years that were dismissed. Now it's happened in Alabama. Nikki Haley has come out and said, yes, I think that an embryo, 100 cells, is a human being. Well, that's going to lose her a lot of support from Democrats and moderates. Those polls that we saw earlier supporting Nikki Haley, those numbers are going to tank this weekend, probably. So this is really interesting. Gretchen Whitmer, Governor of Michigan, she is out front and centre as a campaign surrogate on this issue, as is Vice President Kamala Harris. So those two are going to be probably front and centre of this debate, and the next two in line should something happen to Joe Biden.
Yeah, 1 in 6 couples having fertility issues are a lot of people to burn in an election, John.
Certainly is.
I mean, obviously, this particular ruling was very specific to Alabama law, and I would argue it was a bad ruling even for Alabama law. I'll go into detail in PEP if you're interested. It's all very well to say, well, this won't happen anywhere but Alabama. But as you say, they said this wouldn't happen anywhere only 6 months ago, and now it's happened. And there's already IVF clinics shutting down in Alabama because they're scared of being sued.
Yeah.
And so the more this is in the news, this kind of stuff, the more people could become scared, well, this might happen in my state.
Right.
And just the more abortion stays in the news, full stop, it helps Democrats, which is obviously why Trump is starting to clear his throat about his own proposal, which is a 16-week, apparently, it's been leaked, a 16-week national ban with exceptions for rape and incest and the life of the mother. He thinks he can thread the needle, but of course the thing is, Trump's theory, while it's a compromise of sorts, it's not a compromise for the red states. They don't get their rules pushed back to 16 weeks.
Right, yeah.
It's just the blue states get their rules pushed down to 16 weeks.
That's right, yeah. So the federal ban, whereas Dobbs was seen as handing over decisions about restrictions, including week number thresholds and so on, that was handing the power back to the states. And everyone said, OK, the individual states will now decide, righto, that's the post-Roe reality. But if a federal ban comes in over the top of that, telling New York, your current 24 weeks is now 16 weeks. Yeah, that is a very, very big deal and quite disingenuous based on what Trump has repeatedly said about this. The Dobbs ruling was justified because states can now make up their own minds. Well, they can't under this. So that's going to be a problem for you.
That's a great call. The only thing I would, and basically, as far as I'm concerned, anytime they're talking about abortion, Trump is losing. Doesn't matter what they're saying. But the other thing I would say is just on, you mentioned Gretchen Whitmer, you mentioned some of the other candidates. I should just say there is polling beginning on these candidates already for the Ezra Kleins out there.
Yeah.
And in case you're interested, Emerson did a poll this week. Biden was losing to Trump by 1 point in the Emerson poll. Kamala Harris was losing by 3 points. Gavin Newsom was losing by 10 points. And Gretchen Whitmer was losing by 12 points. Now, name recognition is a big factor there for Whitmer and Newsom. You can see their numbers. No, it's not like Trump gets more against them, they just get less. And what that poll suggests to me is that Trump gets the same amount no matter who runs against him. Yeah. It's just a question of whether the Democrats turn out for the other person. So I would just say, don't assume, all because Joe Biden has his negatives, that the other candidates might not have their negatives as well.
Yeah, we just, the electorate don't yet know them. Yeah, interesting. There were 2 more general election polls this week that put former President Donald Trump in front of President Biden. One was from YouGov. It had Trump 1 point in front, 4 points the lead for Trump in the Morning Consult poll this week. It's still 9 months, of course, until Election Day, with lots of court cases, campaignings and conventions to come. Maybe the presidential debates, if they happen, could be decisive. Perhaps third-party candidates like Robert F. Kennedy could help decide the winner of this election. But whatever happens, it is likely to be another close one. American presidential elections have provided some very close contests in the 21st century. Twice, a Democrat has won more votes overall, but lost the presidency due to the state-by-state vote and the quirks of the Electoral College.
I'm sorry that we did not win this election for the values we share and the vision we hold for our country.
In 2016, Hillary Clinton won 2.8 million more votes nationally, but not where it counted. Donald Trump won the swing states of Pennsylvania by 44,000 votes, Michigan by fewer than 11,000, and Wisconsin by under 23,000 votes. So, the presidency came down to 77,774 votes.
It is time for us to come together as one united people.
Oh well, maybe next time. But the squeaker of all time was George W. Bush's defeat of Al Gore in 2000. That year, all eyes were on Florida, which the networks first called for Gore.
We're going to now project an important win for Vice President Al Gore. NBC News projects that he wins the 25 electoral votes in the state of Florida.
And then they backflipped.
George Bush is the president-elect of the United States. He has won the state of Florida, according to our projections.
The recount began. Some counties had confusing butterfly ballot papers where many believe that votes meant for Gore went to right-winger Pat Buchanan instead. Paper punch voting machines were a problem as well. They left dimpled chads and hanging chads. Some of them were counted, some of them were discarded. The lawsuits flew thick and fast. When the US Supreme Court ended the recount, Bush was in front by just 537 votes. That's out of almost 6 million cast in the state. And it wasn't just Florida on a knife edge in 2000 in New Hampshire. Bush won with a margin of around 7,000. If Gore had claimed the Granite State, he still would have been president. Greens candidate Ralph Nader drew 22,000 votes in New Hampshire, almost 4% of the total cast.
Do you ever think of just voting your conscience and feeling good about your vote?
Many Democrats still think Ralph Nader cost Al Gore the White House.
We've won with the most votes ever cast on a presidential ticket.
The next closest contest was Joe Biden's defeat of Donald Trump in 2020. Fewer than 43,000 votes, the final margin in 3 swing states. Flip those, and Trump would have tied the Electoral College and probably been handed power by the Republican majority in the House of Representatives. 2012 was more definitive. President Barack Obama re-elected comfortably in the Electoral College, 332 to 206, and he won the popular vote by almost 5 million. In 2008, Obama's defeat of John McCain was very clear-cut. His popular vote margin was close to 10 million. Obama won the Electoral College, 365 to 173. 2004 was a close contest though. Republican President George W. Bush running for a second term against Democratic Senator John Kerry, all in the aftermath of 9/11 and the ongoing wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. That election came down to the state of Ohio, which Bush won by just 118,601 votes.
America has spoken, and I'm humbled by the trust and the confidence of my fellow citizens.
The bottom line is this: America is a deeply and fairly evenly divided nation. Presidential elections can and do come down to a few thousand, even a few hundred votes. And in a non-compulsory system, who turns up to vote decides who will govern.
Like there aren't enough foreign policy headaches for Joe Biden right now, there may be one more building in North Korea. About a month ago, the New York Times passed on a warning from 2 North Korean specialists. Robert Carlin, who's been analysing North Korea for 50 years for the CIA and State Department, amongst other organisations, and Siegfried Hecker, a nuclear expert who's visited North Korea 7 times and was given extensive access to their nuclear programs. So what was the warning? They believe that, like his grandfather in 1950, Kim Jong-un has made a strategic decision to go to war. That sounds bad. Well, what was their evidence for that? They say at the start of 2023, the war preparation themes started appearing regularly in high-level North Korean pronouncements for domestic consumption. Then days after that article came out, we heard that North Korea has formally abandoned peaceful reunification as a key policy goal, and they now see the South as an enemy that must be subjugated, if necessary, through a nuclear war. Kim ordered the revision of the North's constitution as well as its propaganda guidelines to remove references to peaceful reunification and to instill in his people the view that the South was a foreign country and the most hostile state. They've also dismantled all government agencies charged with promoting exchanges with the South, as well as removing propaganda monuments dedicated to the same cause. This monument here, for example, which has apparently now been removed according to satellite images. So they seem to mean business. So what does this all mean? Let's return to where it all began, the North Korean analysis site 38 North, and ask its director, as well as the Stimson Center Senior Fellow, Jenny Town, what she thinks is going on. Jenny, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So what, in your view, are the most significant changes in North Korea's behaviour in the last few months?
Beyond the last few months, I think we've seen some major trends in North Korea policy that really fundamentally reframe how they think about their nuclear program and their foreign policy, especially their relationship to South Korea. This includes the enshrining of their nuclear weapons program and a mandate to continue developing WMD into law, especially into their constitution. They have now abrogated the special relationship with South Korea, the inner Korean relationship, and disbanded those institutions that treat South Korea separate from its other foreign policy. And now, there's definitely been a real emphasis on war readiness and war preparedness, and the willingness and a real strategy shift of, if there is war, that North Korea will fight to win, instead of just fighting to stave off further conflict.
Now, when the New York Times reported on these changes, they said the following, and I'll quote them. In announcing the drastic shift, the North's leader Kim Jong-un said the North no longer saw the South as the partner of reconciliation and reunification, but instead as an enemy that must be subjugated, if necessary, through a nuclear war. So I just want to check, did Kim Jong-un explicitly say he wanted to subjugate South Korea to nuclear war, potentially? Because I would have thought that would be a pretty big deal if he explicitly said that.
He did not explicitly say that. He definitely rejected the notion of a pathway towards peaceful reunification. But all of the statements that are dealing with the idea of a revolutionary war or subjugating South Korea with nuclear war is really couched in contingency. So if there is conflict, again, the strategy now is to fight to win control over the Korean Peninsula, rather than what's long been held belief of North Korea is likely, for instance, to escalate, to de-escalate, to prevent a real conventional war from ensuing, much like what we see happening in Ukraine.
So do you think all these changes actually reflect a real change in policy from North Korea, or are they maybe just a signal that they want to send to South Korea and the West?
There's definitely a policy change here, especially because in order to do this, Kim Jong-un has definitely questioned the logic of his grandfather, of the founder. And this is a very major move. It really separates him from his grandfather, from his father, and from that tradition of treating South Korea as a special relationship. But I think it is, again, a broader reflection of the disillusionment that there is a reason to preserve that special status, because in the past, it could move forward on a very different track. It did not include a denuclearization component in the past up until 2018. And now that it is tied into, and so intimately tied into, that denuclearization narrative, there's no real reason to preserve it as a special status, a special relationship, independent of its other relations.
So how's South Korea responding to all this?
I think, South Korea is trying to read the signals, as we all are, of what does this actually mean, what actually changes in the relationship. I think it's worth pointing out that South Korea has talked about eliminating the Ministry of Unification, which would also, on their end, change that special relationship status with North Korea. They've talked about this as far back as the Lee Myung-bak administration. So, it isn't necessarily a new concept on the Korean Peninsula, but certainly the North Koreans have been much more decisive in their actions than what South Korea has when dealing with this issue.
Finally, let's go to the long term. How do you see resolution occurring with North Korea eventually? Or can you not see a resolution occurring with North Korea?
It's difficult right now because we do seem to be really caught in this spiral of, when they do provocative behaviors, we react with, equally provocative language and muscular language. So, if we continue on the track we are, I think we really are pushing ourselves towards real miscalculation, right? Because at this point in time, it's really unclear where there might be red lines, what constitutes too much, too far, too big of an action. And with both sides, emphasizing, preemptive strategies, the signaling does matter. So I think, like I said, we really need to be trying to tamp down some of the reactionary responses, some of the reactive military drills, and really kind of settle into the what's necessary, and control the narrative better, in order to really create some off ramps to this cycle we're on. Because otherwise, I do think we are pushing ourselves towards a conflict prone situation.
Jenny Town, thanks for visiting Planet America.
Thanks for having me.
A guest on Planet America this week, businessman and activist Bill Browder, is one of the world's leading critics of Russian President Vladimir Putin. And he has no doubts that Putin was responsible for the death of opposition figure ALEXEI Navalny in a Siberian prison last week. US President Joe Biden agrees. Browder described Navalny's apparent killing as the equivalent of the assassination of American civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King in 1968. He also thinks that Navalny's widow, Yulia, will now emerge as a powerful leader of the opposition to Putin's regime. Here's some more of our interview with Bill Browder, who now lives in fear for his own life.
So Alexei Navalny started out as a anti-corruption activist. He didn't start out as a politician. He was just documenting corruption in Russia and then making videos and other media projects about it and putting it out online. And what he discovered was that corruption in Russia is the single biggest issue facing all people in Russia. And all his videos became popular, and that became a political platform. And the more he exposed the rotten core of the Putin regime, the more people jumped on his bandwagon. And eventually he became genuinely the most popular and perhaps the only real politician in Russia. Putin is not a politician. Putin is a dictator, a little man who just uses police to arrest and kill people who are his enemies and suppress everybody else. But Navalny had a very positive message, which is to clean it all up, to give people freedom, democracy, and some normal standard of living coming from the resources of Russia, which shouldn't be stolen from the people. And so anyone who knew him understood that he was really a very positive, great man who was beloved by many, many people in Russia.
Now, some have said that if Putin succeeds in Ukraine, he'll then just move on to invade some other country, like Poland, for example. But hasn't his inability to plough over Ukraine made that much less likely?
Well, he's been unable to plough over Ukraine for 2 years as the West has supplied the Ukrainians with significant weapons to fight back. If for some reason, like say Donald Trump gets elected in November and the weapons and the military aid stops, Putin may very well succeed. And if he gets Ukraine, then he gets all their soldiers and all their weapons to go and then move on to Poland and Estonia. And then the West faces a much more terrible choice. Instead of just supplying weapons to Ukraine, the West then faces a choice: do we go to war with Russia because these countries are members of NATO? Or do we abandon NATO and let Putin then run not just over Ukraine, but over Poland and Estonia and Lithuania? Either choice is a terrible one, and God help us if we have to make those choices.
How do you respond to people who say that NATO has outlived its usefulness, and Ukraine shows that if an Eastern European country is invaded, its neighbours will come to defend it, whereas NATO just makes Russia jumpy and Europeans complacent about their defence spending? How do you respond to all that?
Well, I would say that those are probably sentiments coming from a faraway country like Australia. I've got friends who sit in Poland and Estonia and Lithuania and Latvia, and let me tell you, if NATO didn't exist, they wouldn't exist.
When it comes to future sanctions against Russia over this killing, Bill, what do you think would be most effective?
Well, in my mind, any sort of individual sanctions are probably too incremental for a crime of this magnitude. My suggestion and my policy recommendation is that there's $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves that were frozen after the first week of the war. And the thing that would really punish Putin would be to confiscate those Russian central bank reserves, give them to Ukraine for their defense and reconstruction, and call it the Navalny Act. So Putin understands that for killing Alexei Navalny, he lost $300 billion.
On a very different note, do you think the Tucker Carlson interview of Putin turned out to be just embarrassing for Putin? or do you think it actually achieved his aims?
No, it didn't work out for either Tucker or Putin. See, what you need to understand about Putin is that whatever the fantasies were of Tucker Carlson of the outcome of this interview, Putin is a guy who's been a dictator. He has no concept and no ability to charm anybody, convince anybody, or do any of the things that Tucker Carlson wanted him to do. It was insulting to anyone who watched it. It was 2 hours long, and he went droning into these boring history lessons that were made up history that nobody cared about, which was definitely not what Tucker wanted. It didn't help Putin in any way. And the whole thing seemed like a big fiasco, all built up to be some amazing thing. And I don't know anyone who could watch it all the way through. It was really something especially boring.
Of course, Bill, we're well into another American presidential election year. What is your expectation? What role do you think Vladimir Putin is going to seek to play in American politics in 2024?
Well, he's obviously very keen on getting Trump elected. And so he will use all the tools that he's used in the past, from his St. Petersburg troll factory to flood the airwaves of Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and anything else he can with messages that either muddy the water, create chaos, create internal divisions, and support Donald Trump. That's what he's all about. That's what he did last time back in 2016. It worked. It didn't work in 2020. We'll see what happens in 2024.
Bill, in the space of a few days, Alexei Navalny's widow, Yulia, has suddenly become a globally significant figure. What can you tell us about who she is and what the future might have in store for her now?
Well, Putin thought he was getting rid of his most feared adversary. And now he ends up with someone perhaps even more powerful than Alexei Navalny, which is a woman, a very articulate, charismatic, and attractive woman who's going to fight for justice for her murdered husband and carry on with his campaign. That's a very powerful adversary, and one who's not sitting in jail, but one who can speak over the airwaves, and speak to politicians, and speak to the Russians from hopefully a safe location abroad. And I think that that's going to cause Putin all sorts of trouble in the future.
Bill Browder, can I ask you about your sense of personal safety? You are a prominent critic of Vladimir Putin, and we've just seen evidence of the fact that that is a very dangerous thing to be. Are you worried about your personal well-being?
I'm very concerned. I think that Putin crossed a threshold. By killing Alexei Navalny, he's basically telegraphed a view that he doesn't care about anything. He doesn't care about what anyone thinks, and he doesn't care about any repercussions, and he'll do whatever he pleases. And that means that he could easily, just as easily as he killed Navalny, he could send out death squads to London and other countries to kill his enemies abroad. And of course, being one of his biggest enemies abroad, obviously that's very concerning.
Finally, what would you advise a regular Russian citizen to do if they don't like Putin's rule?
Well, unfortunately, it's very hard, because if you speak up, you go to jail or worse. I think that the best thing to do if you're a regular Russian is to get the hell out of there and try to find a home in a safe location in a different country, because Russia is really turning into the most horrible, repressive police state.
Bill Browder, thank you for taking the time to talk to us this week.
Thank you.
Finally this week, Australian audiences have been flocking to see Taylor Swift in concert. Increasing numbers of Americans, meanwhile, seem to be flocking to the conspiracy theory that she's part of a government psyop to rig the election in favour of Joe Biden. A poll this week found that just under 1/3 of Republicans, 18% of all respondents, believe that Taylor Swift is, quote, part of a covert government effort to re-elect President Joe Biden. Well, conspiracies aside, this Monmouth poll also looks at Swift's potential influence with voters. 39% of adults say they have a favourable impression of the singer, while just 13% have an unfavourable view. 6% of respondents consider themselves to be full-on Swifties. Overall, 68% of Americans, though, say they do support Taylor's attempts to encourage her fans to enrol to vote in the upcoming election. So Yay for democracy.
Hang on, 39% favourables. So Trump's right. He is more popular than Taylor Swift.
She's about as popular as Joe Biden, in fact, yeah.
I think the kids probably make a difference to
Maybe
those numbers.
they do.
But anyway, look, this poll has really gotten around this week, prompting headlines like, alarmingly high number of Republicans think Taylor Swift is a psyop. But I reckon the main thing this poll shows is that everyone likes spreading bullshit about Taylor Swift, including news outlets and including polling companies. So let's just look at that polling question again, shall we? Do you think that a covert government effort for Taylor Swift to help Joe Biden win the presidential election actually exists or not? So a covert government effort, that could be referring to a psyop, yeah, to rig the Super Bowl and to rig the election or whatever the theory is. Or it could just be referring to a plan from Biden's people to seek an endorsement from Taylor Swift, which, by the way, is reality. I read that in the New York Times. That question, as asked, could actually mean anything. We can't know what's in these people's heads, if any of them actually endorse the Taylor Swift conspiracy theory, because Monmouth didn't ask them anything about the Taylor Swift conspiracy theory. But then Monmouth just slapped on a headline on top about the Taylor Swift, quote, election conspiracy theory anyway, even though they didn't ask about it, which is just flat out misleading. Now, you might think I'm splitting hairs here. Everyone knows what Monmouth were referring to with their question, right? No, wrong. You know how I know that? Because Monmouth told me. They specifically asked people whether they had heard of the covert government effort for Taylor Swift to help Joe Biden, and 54% of people said no. So the majority of people in their poll had no idea what Monmouth were referring to. And here's the best bit. 42% of those who answered yes to the question also said they had not heard about this covert effort before being contacted by Monmouth. So Monmouth used the most neutral, sensible language they could come up with to bait people into agreeing with a view that Monmouth then characterised as something significantly crazier in their headline, even though almost half the people who said yes openly admitted they had no idea what Monmouth was talking about. And now I just rewarded them with 90 seconds more airtime for their efforts. So you cannot win, John.
Nice rant, Chaz, but here's why you're wrong.
Oh, here we go.
I think you're being a little bit hard on Monmouth,
Yeah.
and you are splitting hairs, because I think use of the word covert makes it very, very clear that they're not just talking about a public endorsement. We do know that Taylor Swift endorsed Biden in 2020. She baked those cookies, after all. And yeah, she is. There's nothing covert about the fact she's going to endorse Joe Biden again. She's going to encourage young voters to enrol to vote again. She's going to do all of those things. So I think it's well and truly understood what covert actually means. What's interesting about this, though, and the point you make about half the respondents hadn't heard of the conspiracy theory, the covert, the psyop, etc., is that tells you something about the effectiveness of polls and how polls can be used to push ideas as well. Pollster rings up and says, well, Mr. Licciardello, thank you, would you mind answering a few questions? Who would you be more likely to vote for in the Republican primary in South Carolina? Nikki Haley, right. Would you be more or less inclined to vote for Nikki Haley if you discovered she'd had 10 abortions from 10 different men while her husband has been serving overseas somewhere in Africa? Oh, I'd be less. Oh, okay, less, all right. So, yes, pollsters can be mischievous. In this case, I think Monmouth, it's just bubblegum.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, but, you know, it does tell us something serious about polling and also about people's propensity to believe stuff. And also, do people really believe it when they tell a pollster this thing? I mean, in a sense, it's a proxy for saying, do you like Taylor Swift or not? Do you like Joe Biden or not?
I'll tell you what I'll concede. I won't concede the first part, because the New York Times article I was referring to specifically said it was a secret plan to get Taylor Swift to endorse.
Great secret. She did it last time.
I know, it's a stupid article, but I'm just saying that that was the New York Times piece. But what I do totally agree is that this does actually tell you something.
Yes.
Which is along the lines of what you were saying. It tells you that a third of Republicans, so a sixth of Republicans,
yes,
will say whatever they think the pollster doesn't want to hear.
Right.
Because it's really, really obvious. The pollster is seeing them up.
It's the old transgressive thrill of Trumpism.
Yeah,
It's just,
And so we should bear that in mind when we see these kinds of polls.
Good, you agree with me. And that's it for another Fireside Chat. We'll see you for Planet America on Wednesday night at 9 p.m. on ABC iView and YouTube, and at about 9:50 for another few weeks on ABC TV.
And don't forget the Planet Pet podcast and all the usual pod places, Spotify, iTunes, all that kind of stuff. You know the drill. See you there.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.